everyone. This is update for February 6, 2024, day 713 of the war and of the date update. Also, catch up for February 4 and 5. As always, I'm going to start with general strategic update, and then I'm going to switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. First, I'm going to start with the financial help from the U.S. To Ukraine and what's going on there. As I mentioned before, the help is probably not gonna materialize ever at this point. I think it's becoming more and more clear. There is a dysfunctional situation between the two opposing parties in the U.S. and the parliament there. And the key issue is that uh, Ukraine cannot, or Ukrainian leadership cannot present credible, clear strategy of the war in Ukraine. So that's one important point. And then there's obviously internal politics in the U.S. where there's simply it's impossible for Democratic Party to close the border, and it's also unacceptable for the Republican Party to keep the border open. So this obviously leads to the sort of situation where there's no any kind of resolution, and it's all probably going to be like that till the election in the U.S. And speaking about that election, de facto, effectively, Donald Trump is becoming like a president in the U.S. at this point because he can stop or stop anything he wants. He basically is having a veto on any policy in U.S. because he's leading in the polls in the U.S. in very clear way, and he can essentially tell Republican majority in the lower chamber what to do and what not to do. So effectively, he is. That's why I'm saying he's effectively a president at this point, and it's going to be, I would say, more and more pronounced over time as his leading position will become more sort of solidified and more clear. And so again, once he's elected, it's very clear Ukraine is not going to get any help from the U.S. So it does look as if Ukraine is not going to get anything from the U.S. In the foreseeable future, unless, as I mentioned, there is a compromise between Democratic and Republican Party, but it's something that's sort of existential for each party because effectively all these immigrants are viewed as the voters of Democratic Party. So Democratic Party wants more voters, more support, and obviously that's a net loss for the Republican Party. They obviously don't want this extra voters, Democratic voters in the U.S., so they want this to close the border. The rest is essentially rhetoric to cover this up. Whatever the discussion about, protecting people and crime and so on, it's really just, as I said, attempt to basically cover the real intents and the real reasons why this is happening. Additional reason is that these immigrants present cheap labor in the U.S. So big business and medium-sized business is definitely pushing and obviously pushing politicians to keep the border open. So this is essentially what's really driving this whole situation in the U.S. How it's going to get resolved is still unclear. It does appear it's not going to get resolved till probably election time. And so again, this is all tied, and it's tied to the situation in Ukraine. And as I said, additional sort of aggravating factor in all of the situation that Ukrainian leadership made is that they sided very clear with Democratic Party. So from a perspective of Republican Party, they effectively want Ukrainian leadership to fail, to basically prove that this whole policy was a failure from the very beginning and a failure of Democratic Party. So it's becoming sort of topic in Ukraine is becoming basically collateral damage in the fight between the Democratic and Republican Party in the U.S. Unfortunately, that's just sad reality of it, and Ukraine cannot escape it. So now it's go back to the situation inside of Ukraine. So there's a little bit of economic information. The Ukrainian central bank released its numbers for its foreign exchange reserves and how much it was basically spending, and how many billions of those reserves were sold to support the economy. So Ukraine has, as of February 1, 38 billion US dollars. And the net selling of Ukrainian central bank is about 2.5 billion US dollars per month. Though this basically gives a ballpark that Ukraine can survive for the next 12 months, basically definitely till February of 2025. It's going to be extremely tight. So Ukrainian government already announced that they stopped all non-essential expenses. So basically only military expenses and only like salaries to like governmental employees, including teachers, including pensioners, which is a huge part of expenses. So everything else is apparently being stopped. There is no clear, I would say, itemization of the expenses that were stopped. There's generic terms, but that's the situation. So effectively, Ukrainian government is kind of like working in a crisis mode, and Ukraine as a whole. The only positive, as I mentioned before, this 12.5 billion US dollars, or I think euros, from European Union, which obviously will help. Will basically be a cushion for Ukraine, but it's not going to solve the problem. So the problem still remains. At the same time, very interesting fact: Ukraine is still paying interest and basically repaying principal on its foreign external debt that it borrowed from the international markets, which is doesn't make any sense at this point. It's the situation is about survival of the country, and Ukraine should clearly declare bankruptcy on all of those obligations, because it's simply not feasible, and it's very reasonable situation. You cannot, it's very clearly bankruptcy situation. There's no question about that. Now I'm gonna switch to the situation on the battlefield, and I'm just gonna talk a little bit generically about the overall situation, because there's a lot of, I would say, it's not rumors, but statements such as Russian command amassed like 40,000 troops on this North Lugansk front line near Kupiansk and ready to attack, and it has 500 tanks and so on. So this, in a way, information is kind of like taken out of the context, because if you really think, most of this section of the front line has like at least 100,000 troops. Some of them have like 200,000. So this central Donbass, northern Donbass, probably together have close to, I would say, 300,000 Russian troops and probably at least 1,000 tanks. So it's and let's say North Luhansk front line has at least probably minimum like 40,000 troops, and probably that 400, 500 tanks is probably sort of what it has as a normal situation. So saying that 40,000 troops are there and they're ready to attack is effectively not truly saying anything, because this is normal situation to have at least 100,000 troops there and roughly that number of tanks. The question if they are being accumulated in a in a fist, in an attacking fist or offensive fist, that's totally different story. But there's no clear indication that that's really happening in large numbers to have really truly proper offensive, not just this sort of peasant army squeezes that's been happening across the front line. That's totally different story. And partially another reason why this is a very unrealistic situation, if let's say we take 100,000 troops, let's say this is north, and this is obviously I don't have exact numbers, but roughly plus minus, it's directionally will be correct. So if we take this, let's say 100,000 troops, out of that, roughly uh, half is basically support. So they're not participating by design in the in military action. So you have 50,000 left for actual action, and then out of that 50,000, and this is obviously anecdotal information, roughly at least, or I would say at least 50% of those are simply not willing to go into the fight. There's even like nickname for this people. It's they called 500. So like the reason for that is that 200 is the nickname for being dead, 300 wounded, 400 I actually don't know, and then for whatever reason it's 500 for people who refuse to basically fulfill their duty. So this usually at least 50% of the population there, and sometimes it's as high as 70%. So out of 50,000, you have at best 20,000 that's actually capable of doing anything, and then sometimes it's even less. It drops to like 20,000. So now think about this front line. It's pretty long. It's nearly impossible to accumulate anything meaningful. You need to keep all spread the troops across the entire front line. So this is what also drives partially that all of this military action is really like a peasant army, as I mentioned before, where it just squeezes for the territory, primitive, uh, you know, uh, that they are not truly how they were, let's say, even in World War One or World War Two in terms of actual military action. So again, so this is hopefully explains the situation about this whole situation. Plus, Ukraine still has more troops on the front line. So Russia has roughly 600. Ukraine has roughly 900,000 troops. Ukrainian military is completely unable to maneuver with the troops, with the reserves, basically move from the area where there is less pressure to the area where there is more Russian pressure, which is sort of how it's supposed to be. This is normal practice. So again, this goes back to this is like they all manage, and the Russian side is similar. They all manage like a peasants' army where there is no even ability to move troops, to accumulate forces across the front line, essentially, or basically redistribute the forces as needed depending on the situation or the plan, or the military plan. So okay, hopefully this little bit sort of explains. Now I'm gonna do walkthrough in a clockwise fashion. So the situation along the state border remains more or less the same. There is no clear indication of any sort of large-scale invading forces from the Russian side. Now let's actually jump to this North Luhansk front line. Surprisingly, things were quiet overall, with exception of some minor attacks against this village Terny here. Apparently, Russian 47th Mechanized Division is sort of reorganizing itself, digging in and consolidating what it gained, and preparing for the sort of next steps, next attacks. Now let's look at the North Donbass front line. Things here is actually somewhat unusual. There are pretty strong Russian attacks against this village Bilohorivka, basically in this area where I'm showing. Um, Totally unclear. Totally doesn't make sense what's happening here. But nevertheless, Russian command is putting very strong pressure there so far. So far, Ukrainian troops are holding on, but you never know, sort of as I say. Now let's move to the southern sector of the North Donbass front lines. Things here are more or less the same. Russian pressure around Klishivka and Bogdanika, Khromovo, this area, west of Bakhmut, but so far without any major advances. It is not possible to sort of show or discuss, 100 to 200 meter type of advances. If Russian troops capture any, village, I'll definitely, let them know. Now let's look at the central Donbass front line. Things here are the same, but it's very clear that Ukrainian forces are basically cracking and losing Avdiivka. It's becoming more and more pronounced. Russian troops gain more ground on their northern flank. So basically, the bottleneck becoming sort of tighter and tighter. At some point, it will be natural ejection of Ukrainian troops from this salient. So, and that moment is sort of not far away. It's very clear that dynamic is, accelerating in a negative direction for Ukrainian troops, and actually can explain how this is happening in this case. For the most part, this defense is done by 110th Brigade, and what's happening is that Ukrainian command simply not sending replacement, not sending reserves. So basically, they just extremely rigid and static. 110th Brigade, okay, you hold on no matter what. You're not gonna get any support, replacement, whatever. Just with your own forces. Obviously, they bleed to death eventually. It got to the point that this brigade is sending this supporting that 50% that I said, that sort of support troops or people basically who doing all sort of various not combat roles. So such as, for example, could be like mechanics for the cars, drivers for the cars, whatever, like all sorts of I would call it bureaucratic personnel. It's being sent to the front line because the actual frontline combat units are extremely thin. There is no replacement, and so things are becoming, that's why this brigade is having a hard time holding on the line in defensive position, and so Russian troops are figuring out holes and gaps in Ukrainian defenses just simply because the line is so thin. And going back, I just want to highlight how the extremely poor management of this sort of resources by Ukrainian command, because Ukrainian army nominally number-wise, number of people is larger than Russia, as I stated. It's 900,000 versus 600. So in theory, there should not be any problem shortage of people, at least. Yet this is the problem, and this situation has been developing for a long time, since like early October. So you can always react as a commander, bring more reserves and so on. But nothing of that is happening here, and obviously this is eventually going to lead to loss of Avdiivka. Then there are some relatively weaker Russian attacks in this, I would say, Novomikhailivka salient, or this kind of corner here around former Marinka and Krasnohorivka, without any major advances by Russian troops there. Now let's look at the situation along the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are fairly quiet. Some pretty weak Russian attacks around Rybodine, but really nothing major here. Last section of the front line along Dnipro River. Things here also fairly sort of normal, standard. Russian troops continuing their attempts to destroy Ukrainian bridgehead at Krinky without success. Actually, Ukrainian, as I mentioned in the last video, actually Ukrainian forces are slowly but surely expanding this bridgehead. It costs quite a lot in terms of lives. But it's totally unclear to me what's the end goal by Ukrainian command, because it's very clear that there's no imminent plans to attack, or not even imminent, but even I would say it's absolutely questionable whether Ukrainian army will be able to actually do any major offensive. It was so-called offensive, but let's say generally offensive against the Russian army, given that it doesn't have basically enough of heavy equipment, and there's no steady supply of that due to lack of support from the U.S. basically as the main donor of the military equipment. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye bye.